In this module, you're going to learn about civil liberties. And in the next module, the following week, you're going to learn about civil rights. For both of these topics, though, we're going to focus on a specific case study. For civil liberties, you're going to learn about the National Security Agency scandal that was leaked in 2013 because of a whistleblower named Edward Snowden. Maybe you recognize that name. And then the following week, you're going to read an article titled The Case for Reparations, written by Ta-Nehisi Coates. In this video, though, I just want to go over the difference between civil liberties and civil rights and give you a little bit more background specifically on the NSA Edward Snowden scandal / controversy. First, let's talk about the difference between civil rights and civil liberties. Maybe you already know this, but let's just be sure that we understand the distinction. Civil liberties are all of the limitations that we impose on government. They're sort of all of the spheres or spaces within our individual personal lives that we say the government cannot intervene with, or the government sort of cannot invade. For instance, the government cannot walk into your home, invade your privacy without a warrant for that search, right? Alternatively, civil rights are all about the things that the government actually needs to proactively do in order to ensure that everybody has the same opportunities. Okay, so civil rights legislation, for instance, may intervene in some sort of situation in which people are being discriminated against because of their identity, maybe because of their ethnicity, their sexual identity, or their gender. So for instance, a famous piece of civil rights legislation is Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972. Title IX simply states that you cannot discriminate based upon sex or gender, that every educational institution has to provide equal academic and athletic opportunities for men and women. What does that mean? Well, now RCC or UCR has to have the same number of athletic programs for women as they do men. Okay. Now, the reason that legislation was passed is because prior to that, higher education institutions or athletic programs, athletic teams, would primarily prioritize male athletes rather than female athletes. Okay, so civil rights, the government intervenes, right? Civil liberties is all about where we tell the government to stop, sort of where we draw the line in the sand. Okay, so our civil liberties are listed out in the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. This is referred to as the Bill of Rights. So you guys are really familiar already with your Second Amendment rights, the right to bear arms, your First Amendment rights, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, so on and so forth. I could teach an entire class on just one of these amendments, right? We could have an entire class, a semester-long course that focuses just on freedom of religion or freedom of speech. So that's why I don't want to take a comprehensive approach to this in this module, and I don't want you to either. Instead, I want to kind of narrow in on the Fourth Amendment and some things that we can apply from this other amendment, the Ninth Amendment, that says that there are like other rights that just aren't listed out in the Bill of Rights that maybe we didn't think of. In addition to that, right, the Third Amendment says no quartering of soldiers. Well, that's something that was prevalent in the late 1700s. A military officer would knock on your door and ask if you could feed him and house him. That's not really an issue that we face today. So why is the Third Amendment relevant to us? Well, that's because we kind of imply from this, we dissect from this that there are these areas, aspects of our lives, again, that the government cannot invade, such as a military officer wanting to stay in our house and sleep on our couch and eat all of our food for the next couple weeks, right? So we'll come back to this sort of implied right to privacy in a second. But first, there are just a couple general themes that I want you to know about civil liberties. The first is that these 10 amendments, just like the example that I gave you about the Third Amendment, you shouldn't be forced to house soldiers, okay? The way in which the Supreme Court interprets these civil liberties or individual rights that the government cannot violate, the way that we interpret this is always changing, it's always evolving, and sort of always requiring an update in its interpretation because with modernization, new issues come up. So with that, the Constitution is a flexible document. What one piece of text from the Bill of Rights means to a Supreme Court justice may not mean the same thing to another Supreme Court justice. And remember, the Supreme Court is in charge of interpreting the Constitution. So they're sort of the referee, the ones reading the rule book and deciding whether or not the government has in fact violated that rule book. The last thing that I want you to understand, though, is that civil liberties are in decline. In other words, protections for individual freedoms are not as strong as they used to be. This is true for the United States, but it's also true for the world at large. So the Freedom House Index is a famous measurement that political scientists and other social scientists use to measure how quote-unquote free a country is. You can go to their website, you can just type in Freedom House Index and look at exactly how they come up with these scores. But if a country has a score of 100, or if it's light pink, so see most of Europe, Australia, New Zealand are light pink, that means that they're mostly free. That means that the government does a pretty good job of respecting individual freedoms, such as freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to publish whatever you want in the local newspaper, freedom to criticize the government, free, fair, and legitimate elections. When you actually vote in an election, you are confident in the fact that that vote is actually going to be counted, and the ones running the election will, in fact, report accurate information to you about how ballots were cast, so on and so forth. Okay, so the countries that are in the darker red colors, those are countries that are more authoritarian rather than democratic. Here's something important for you to know, though. The United States aggregate freedom score is not 100, it's 86 out of 100, which means that there's a lot of room for improvement. In addition to that, there are other countries in the world that are quote-unquote more free than the United States is. So Canada has a 99 out of 100. Finland and Sweden, Norway, they all have a 100 out of 100. There are countries in Africa that have similar freedom scores to the US. Look at this, Ghana has an 83 out of 100, right? Why is it that the United States freedom score has declined so significantly over the last couple years? Well, it has to do with a lot of things. One of the reasons the freedom score in the United States has declined is because of the US-Mexico border crisis and the detaining of asylum seekers coming over from Mexico, the detainment of children of those refugees and asylum seekers coming from Mexico. In addition to that, if you read Freedom House's reports, they also argue that the Trump administration's attacks on the media and the labeling of news stories and reports as fake news is problematic. I know there are a lot of people that may not agree with that, but that's what Freedom House is telling us. In addition to this, the cyber attack on the 2016 presidential election has degraded the integrity of our elections, or in other words, the legitimacy of our elections, right? So if you didn't know this, in 2016, the Russian government spread and disseminated a lot of fake news in the 2016 presidential election, right, in order to get voters to side with either Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders, because they thought that those candidates were the most polarizing candidates and would destabilize the United States as best as possible. Overall, there are more countries in the world that have had a decrease in their freedom score. In other words, the world is just not doing a very good job of protecting individual freedoms. Okay, so if we look at this on the global scale, we could probably deduct that the Syrian refugee crisis related to the Syrian civil war has a huge effect on this. It's one of the reasons why countries have seen a decrease in their freedom scores. On top of that, just internet and technology has made it easier to disseminate fake information, false information, conspiracy theories. And so it's hard for voters to differentiate between what is credible information and not credible information. And just in general, elections worldwide have become more prone to attacks, cyber attacks that minimize their integrity. Let's talk about one specific reason, though, why protections for individual freedoms have degraded over the last couple years in the United States. Let's zero in on the Fourth Amendment. You'll notice that nowhere in the Constitution does it say that US citizens or US residents or anybody in the United States has a quote unquote right to privacy. Instead, a right to privacy is implied through the Fourth Amendment, in addition to the First, Third, and Ninth Amendment that I mentioned earlier in this video. If we read the Fourth Amendment, it says the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause supported by oath, so on and so forth. I'm not going to read the entire thing. However, think about this. This was written a couple hundred years ago. So our founding fathers were able to anticipate that somebody might break into your house, that somebody might look at your diary, but they weren't able to anticipate the fact that we might have email one day, or we might have text messaging, or Zoom conferences, right? So of course, the Constitution doesn't mention that we have a right to privacy. In other words, that we have a right to be able to, kind of keep that information private without the government accessing it or viewing the content of our emails or our text messages. This freedom has been degraded, chipped away at the most over the last decade. The reason for that is 9/11. Okay, what does this have to do with 9/11? Well, 9/11, over 3,000 people died, and the United States was taken by surprise, did not see this attack coming. The guys who flew the planes into the Twin Towers went to flight school in the United States. If we had just looked at what they were doing, listened to their phone calls, looked at their behavior a little bit more closely, maybe we would have been able to prevent this attack. So what happened? Well, just a month after 9/11 happened, the United States passed the United States Patriot Act. This is a bullet point by bullet point explanation of what the US Patriot Act actually did. But what I want to focus in on is this enhanced surveillance procedures aspect of the act. In addition to this, improved intelligence. So what this did is this basically empowered our federal agencies such as the CIA or the NSA or the FBI, gave them more pure view to survey Americans, to hopefully intercept a terrorist attack and prevent it from happening in the first place. Lo and behold, though, as you guys will find out later in this module, it turns out that instead of just targeting specific individuals that seemed suspicious, the United States started looking at everybody's phone calls, everybody's emails, everybody's text messages, right? And so effectively, our right to privacy has gone away. So I want you guys to reflect on this. Do we even have a presumed right to privacy anymore? Should we? Is the right to privacy important or essential to a democracy? Or is this necessary to protect the United States from attacks such as the one that happened on 9/11?